these are three people that like when I want to know what's up, when I want to know how to get stuff done, when I want to know where the Spirit is moving most vibrantly, these are people that I check in with. And I notice what they're up to, and I hope that, I know that you're about to be blessed by what they share. Thank you, Jane, for sharing with us already. There's some questions that came to me as I was listening with Jane, but maybe even before we get started, if each of you can share some about your context and basically where the wisdom is rising up from for you. So, Jane, you've already shared, but if there's anything else, so we'll start with Eric.
Yeah,
Eric,
okay.
Please.
Thanks. It's really an honor to be a part of this, and so I'm grateful to be here. I'm in the Diocese of Southwest Florida, and I guess about 11 years ago, I started working in a quirky little Lutheran Episcopal church as a layperson, trying to play a little bit with the emerging church, and then went off to seminary, and after seminary I wound up in a traditional Episcopal church. So I've actually played in that field some in the established church. But about 2.5 years into that, I went to my bishop and said, I really want to get back to this on the edge kind of ministry again. And like Jane, he gave me permission to do that. So I came on the bishop's staff 3 years ago as diocesan missioner, and we were trying all kinds of experiments. And I know we talked about failure, but if I show up with anything, I can show up with a lot of track record of what would be called failures, but they were awesome experiments that we tried, and it just created a lot of opportunity. And some of the people that have done some of that ministry are here today. So now what I'm doing now is I'm actually working in transition. I'm what they call the old deployment officer. I'm doing some of that. I'm doing clergy revitalization stuff, parish revitalization. So as Stephanie was saying, that established church and the missional church, I kind of ride in the middle of that fine line. I'm kind of in both sides of that, and it's a kind of an interesting tension to try to hold on to. So when I'm out doing vestry retreats or when I'm working with a parish who's looking for a new priest, I just stealthily slide in a little missional conversation with them. So I kind of get to play in both fields. I'm a part of the establishment, but my heart is out there in the missional church. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now.
We need you in both.
Yeah, that's
Amen.
Thank you.
Jason.
My name is Jason Evans, and I am the Young Adult and Campus Ministries Missioner for the Diocese of Washington. Whoa. That's Washington, D.C., not where Twilight was shot.
Pity.
I feel like this is like the middle management panel here. We're not the published authors or bishops or necessarily the people in the grassroots, but middle management. So anyways, so that's what I do for the Diocese of Washington. I get to work with our congregations in the area of young adult ministry, and I support our campus ministers on the different colleges and universities in our diocese.
Mm-hmm. And you're about to maybe stretch into some new... One hopes. All right, so that's your context. Can you each share with us, and this is for Jane too, but so there's a great question that you posed, Jane. How can we walk in the way of Jesus where we live? Mm-hmm. And what I wonder is, where do you see folks, kind of from your middle management post, where are you seeing folks walking in the way of Jesus where they live? What's making you say, yes?
That's a great question.
That's a great question.
I think in our context, there's a few different places that I feel like we see it. Anytime our people, because of their spiritual convictions and their convictions of justice and reconciliation, are compelled to get out of their comfort zone and not just say, I'll sign the petition or write the check, but show up and participate. I think that's one of the places that we see it in our context. And then on a congregational level, I think we see it when congregations are willing to just take risks, to be brave enough to try things that there's no guarantee it's going to work, but they're willing to be amongst people that they can't necessarily rely on for pledges or to be on the vestry. But that's, and I'm sure you guys would say similar things, but that's where I see that oftentimes.
Yeah, for whatever reason, the image that popped into my mind is the people from established churches who come and join the people who are doing these experiments.
Yeah,
Because I think
exactly.
it is a lot easier to say, so I'm picturing this couple from one of our kind of bigger churches in Cincinnati who's been coming to our Northside Abbey gatherings. And I think that sometimes we want to plant churches now without actually sending real people out there to do it. And
It takes people?
yes, there's something like crazy about it, that you have to send committed Christians alongside the people who are doing all the work that we're talking about, listening in the neighborhood and talking, that there's this, the kind of convergence of those two things together for me is the place that I think is so like, yes. And I've often said that I think the kind of work of starting new communities is actually the easy work. It's the shifting of the system that's the harder work, and it's the more time-consuming work. So whenever there's that like willingness to find the established or inherited church stretched to the margins, that's the places I'm super excited. Yeah.
I see it, where, I think a lot of the work that I do, maybe y'all will say this, is we're really people who are listening and seeking. It's kind of like you're looking for like a treasure hunt of different movements of the Spirit in the diocese. And an example that we have in Southwest Florida was, 2 years ago, there was a priest that was in a community that was close to a state community college. And they just had this vision of actually being on that campus and engaging students and building relationships. And it began with the priest and a couple of people in the parish just going there and being present. He asked me to buy $800 worth of furniture to put on the front of the building that they occupied so he could just sit and have coffee with folks. Well, 2 years later, we've got a chaplain assistant who's actually discerning a call to ordained ministry. We have two interns that are actually working on campus. They're doing Bible studies and things. And so when I see that kind of bubble up, we just have to have our ears open and be aware of it. And really, I think our job as the middle management folks is just to come alongside and go, yeah, you go. We're the coaches and the encouragers and the people that just say, yeah, let's do it. And how can I help?
Yeah. I think one of the you were talking about that posture of saying yes, and the interesting thing is that if you start with yes, and sometimes you have to work your way to no, depending on what's going on.
Sometimes.
But when you start with that posture, you don't always know it's going to work.
Absolutely.
And sometimes you're awful surprised. So it's an incredibly humbling practice as well in that, because it's like, okay, well, let's try, and you're like, oh, that didn't work,
right.
or hey, that worked. I'm so surprised.
Yeah, and I think some of it is the asking, I think that standing in that middle place between the two worlds is asking the people in the inherited church to say, let's try it. And you're the one that's kind of working with them as a way of protecting the kind of front runners, the people who are actually out doing the work, so that they don't have to be navigating back through the system. So I feel like that ends up being a really big piece of this, is sort of protecting those people who are so creative and so inspiring, and holding space for them within the institution.
Yeah.
I think of that, what you're describing right now, as being allies in a way, that
Exactly.
we need, that anybody who's out there on the front lines of a struggle needs allies who maybe are not the targets in the same way. And so, God willing, you all are not targets in quite the same way that people who are launching these missional ministries might be. But you have access to power, you have access to conversation spaces, you have access to, to people who otherwise might set their sights on some of these pioneers and make life really hard. What are some of the strategies that you actually try to use? Because it occurs to me that in this room, not everybody's going to go out and launch a new missional ministry, but they might have a chance to be an ally. So what do you say about kind of living on that bridge and being really strategic about creating that space where people can do the experimenting and other folks can basically not sabotage it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few things that come to mind to me. First of all, the sharing of the stories of experimentation is a critical piece. So trying to figure out how to navigate how those stories are heard and told is an important piece, it would seem to me. And I think that ends up being a lot of the time where a lot of our time is spent in that place, I would imagine, of whether it's in front of congregations or diocesan council or bishops saying, "Have you heard this story?" Because I think the thing is that a theme thus far in the short amount of time that we've been here is that it's not clear in all places across the church that the kind of ministries we're talking about or the posture has a high value in the system. Yes. And to add the value seems to be kind of one of the strategic things that we need to be about and doing, is trying to add value to those things. So some of it's interpretive. I find myself constantly trying to think about how can the lessons learned here, whether they're successes or failures, how can these benefit others in the church?
Yes.
And how can we interpret this, export this in a way that other people could say, "Oh gosh, I know something better about ministering to this underserved population or this group of young adults or what have you, because of the work of this mission or this campus ministry or what have you." And the more we do that, the more we add value to those things that don't typically... What is wrong with my mic today?
Yeah,
I think
you got the bad mic.
You have power.
Oh, it's always my mic.
There you go.
I'm just liking the cop in the field right now.
I'm really enjoying this. Can we get closer?
Anything?
Okay. Sorry?
Yeah. Sorry. There we go. Maybe.
Maybe?
Yeah.
Let's give a hand to Christian.
Yay. Well done.
That was
Are you
it.
distracted
I'm
now?
done. Yeah. Take over. It's all you.
I was going to say, for me, some of the work of being an ally is asking the questions that I already know what the church what the answer would be, what the church's answer would be, and asking it anyway to provoke people to question why we do what we do.
Like,
So being the one to ask the question so that the pioneer doesn't have to be the one asking the question, I'll take the heat for the question. And I'll just kind of keep nudging and pushing and being willing to ask really good questions and then say, so why did we do that again? Can you explain it to me? I still don't get it. And so I think there's some of being an ally that is the one who's asking the questions and not being afraid to say, well, I know what the answer is, but I'm going to ask it anyway. That feels to me like one piece of that.
I think for in our context, it's not so much that early on when I started doing the diocesan missionary work, there was a distinct strategy of trying to engage people, and I think, as Jane said, there's seasons, and I think we may be in a season where we're moving into a kind of a fallow area, where the fields are kind of laying fallow right now. But what I'm able to do, because I'm shifting my role in the diocese more in traditional work as a diocesan staff member, is I'm really kind of, like I said, I keep saying that word stealthy, but I'm kind of staying under the radar. And so as I'm engaging with congregations and working with them and trying to help them to kind of rediscover their ministry in their local neighborhoods and how they really engage with other people and establish those relationships, there's times where I'm going in and talking to them, I just try to open that conversation space. So it's not really a well laid out strategy. I'm more trying to be willing to listen to the Spirit, still take some risk, but at the same time trying to work within the established church. So.
Yeah.
I've been talking to I kind of feel like maybe we shouldn't let all our strategies out of the bag, but I've been talking to my fellow missioners since we've been here, and I just went on a pilgrimage to England, and we got to meet with Johnny Baker, and he suggested that one of the things that we need to do to create change is to hack the canons. So he says literally figure out how to break the code and use our existing structures to the benefit of God's mission. And so I've been asking that question a lot. So I go in and say, could this community fit here? And then can we help them get a bank account? And can they get this thing that they need? And so I think some of it is thinking about how to use the resources, whether that's our canons or our financial resources or other people or skills, creatively. I'll put it that way.
I love hack the code.
Yeah.
Hack the canons.
I'm considering how to do that. I'm not the canon expert by a long shot, but
We'll get
I'm
some
looking
lawyers
for
in
some
on that.
people who can help with that. So if any of you are those people, let me know.
Now you know. Awesome. I think that one of the ways that, and I hear this from you all, but I just kind of want to tease this out. One of the ways that we can create that space for pioneers, for missionary folks, for missional leaders to really kind of go out there, to take the risks, to do this experimenting, is by making sure that the rest of the church knows that there's actually a gift in it for all of us.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
You know, and that, I mean, it's the way that I've come to understand it really is that actually all of our salvation is wrapped up in what's going on out there.
Yes.
So it's not just that we have surrogates that we send out and then
Right.
say, you know, go, but it doesn't actually have an impact on us. It absolutely does. What is that impact, would you say? Like, again, because of this middle space that you occupy, what are the gifts that missional ministries are bringing, are teaching, that frankly the rest of the church needs? And that maybe even some of those established churches are going to have to start adopting soon too. So how do you make that case? What do you see?
I kind of see it as kind of like a mind shift. It's a mission focus shift. I mean, what I learned working with pub theologies and some of the things we did, and what we learned as practitioners out in that field, is we're able to bring that back to the church and just kind of help recast a vision for them. And I think maybe that's some of the beauty of that is to just create space for them to be encouraged by a new way of being church and kind of bring that in and integrate.
Yeah, so I sit with our intentional communities at the beginning of the year every year, and one of the things I say to them is, you know, it may feel like there's just 5 of you or 8 of you, but what you are doing here is teaching the rest of the church what it set out to do. And remember how to live life together, and remember how to walk the neighborhood, and remember how to listen for stories from the margins, all of that stuff that we were just talking about. Like, they're the ones on the ground day in and day out, not just one day a week, really doing that work. So I tell them, I'm like, you have lessons to learn, and it's your responsibility to share those back with us as you do this work, you know, to really tell people about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd echo the same thing. I think that's the fact that most of the missional projects that we have going on in our diocese right now are currently on campuses, universities, and colleges, and those ministries are learning something about doing ministry amongst millennials that our congregations by and large don't know and don't understand. And so what we learn there about doing ministry with another generation benefits everybody if we hope to remain vital and healthy.
And for you, I think that's especially, I mean, I would echo that about campus ministries, but I think a lot of what the church has gotten focused on is that we are building up disciples for us, and to say, no, campus ministries actually teach us that we are creating disciples and encouraging people for mission, not because they're going to stay with us here forever and be our next leaders, but because that's what the world needs. And I think the rest of the church needs to figure that out too.
Yeah. We've got a few minutes left on the panel. Am I right about that? Okay. And so I want to open it up and give people the opportunity to ask some questions. Basically, what you have here is the middle management folks who have the opportunity to say yes or no, right? First. And so maybe this is a way to test out some of those questions that it's not as safe to ask when you're back home. But whatever you're wondering about, these are wise folks. So I want to open it up and see if there are questions. There's one right here.
Thanks for sharing what you've shared. You've talked about the work as middle managers that you do to the communities, but you also have access to the institutional structure. And I assume that because you're here, your bishops are enlightened in the ways that you are, and the communities that you're serving are. But what about those bishops and diocesan middle managers that are not enlightened? In what ways are you and your bishops helping them to have a peephole to start to see? Because we need to have more folks like you and your bishops, if they are supportive, which I'm assuming they are, in the church, so that we could continue doing this work. It's not innovative work, but Jesus work.
Right. Yeah. There's a few things that come to mind for me. I think there's a difference between authority and influence, and I think no matter where we find ourselves, we have to figure out where we can have healthy and appropriate influence and use it. And I think, especially in our culture, we wait for being blessed with a particular authority in the system and the hierarchical system that we function in. And so I think that some of it is finding how you can influence wherever that might be. That's one of the first things that will come to mind for me.
What popped into my head is that the same things that we're saying we try to do, I think, is the work that our bishops have to do. So, for instance, my bishop, Bishop Breidenthal, sits on the Bishop's Theology Committee. And this past Lent, they released a kind of study guide, but about new economic models. And some of that came from our diocese, and they videotaped people in our communities telling the stories of how they're doing this. And I think his ability to influence the conversation based on the stories that he knew can help shift the conversation for everyone else. He was pushing other people on the committee to say, tell us what's happening in your local area. Be on the lookout for what God's doing there. I think it's Bishop's job to do that. The other thing I would say is I think that some of our role is this middle role is also their role, which is to kind of dissent against the authority. To say, no, we're not going to do it that way. No, we need to create space for this. And I think they can raise their voices in places of power to do that. Recognizing our power and using it sharing it with people, I think that's the role that these kinds of people, whether they're bishops or have other roles of authority on diocesan staffs or on the Episcopal Church staff, can do that work. I don't know if that's helpful, but
I think we're always going to operate within the established church with economic, ecclesiastical, all those canonical restraints, and I think sometimes, as Jane and Jason says, we're kind of called to kind of push up against that gently, without too much push, but to, just to continue to be calling the church to realize how important this work is.
I frankly, I just always find it easier to ask for forgiveness than permission too. I mean,
Give it up.
Sorry. I didn't know. Yeah. Now I do,
But actually, isn't that why we need those communities, though?
Yeah.
Because there are several people that I know I can call when I'm going through that experience of, had to ask for forgiveness because I didn't get permission, and now I feel about this big. And who are the people who build you back up? Who are the people who remind you why it mattered that you take that risk? And why you will survive to the day after, the dressing down or the failure or whatever. But you've got to have a community. Otherwise, when it happens, when you do get shut down, because it will happen, if there's not that community praying you back up again, you don't necessarily get back up again. So it matters.
One of the other things that I was thinking about earlier, and I don't know if it connects to this, but I think the other thing that bishops can do is set these things aside and protect them from some of the things that are happening in the greater structure. So I think most innovation happens as a kind of parallel development plan, not by trying to break down the existing structure, but by building something up kind of off to the side. So I feel like that's kind of the blessing of my personal situation, is that the bishop kind of gave me space to do some experimenting that didn't have to report to a lot of other places within the structure. I think entrepreneurs tend to do that. They find their own new way around the system, and then people are like, well, you didn't do step A and then B and C and D, but I'm like, I just skipped to D, sorry. So that's the apologizing later thing.
Exactly.
But I think that, that's one of the things that people in power, in authority can do.
Yeah,
We have one more
over
question over here.
Great.
Hi, Emily Wachner, General Seminary. I have a question about money, actually. How do you guys think about it? How do you talk about it? Where does it come from?
Trees.
Never
Lots
been
of
asked that one before.
My line is that the church has lots and lots of resources. The question is whether we will release them to future generations to use to create and recreate communities of spiritual meaning for them. we already have a lot of resources. So my thing about asking the question that other people refuse to ask is I'm always asking, what's that money for? Why was it given? How can we use it? And looking for allies, looking for people who will fund projects. I often joke that I thought I was starting new Christian communities, and I've started a whole lot of not-for-profits in this work.
Wow.
So, you figure out how to do that piece too. And do fundraising and be able to share a story that's missional and compelling and invite other people to join you in it. I don't know if that really answers your question, but.
Yeah. I think I certainly ended up spending a lot more time talking about money than I ever thought I would in this job. I have not been an Episcopalian for terribly long. Before I was an Episcopalian, I planted a faith community, and I never assumed I would get paid to do it. I worked in construction for 10 years, starting digging ditches, literally, and worked my way up so I could do what I felt compelled to do. And I learned a lot of lessons because we had to be scrappy and we had to be creative in how to fund things. And I think there's a value in that. Not that I think everybody needs to go and dig ditches if they want to go plant a missional community, but I do think that there's a scrappiness that makes you innovative and creative in finding solutions that's really necessary in this kind of work, that makes you rely on the context, not just on an institution to pad it for you. So while I'm not saying we shouldn't fund missional work at all, but I also think we have to rethink some of the paradigms we've had around it. There's a lot of assumptions in our system that it should be a really great salary and everything else, and set for however long, 5-7 years, whatever. And in situations where we can do that, that's fantastic. I am just not convinced in what I have seen over the last 20 years that will then produce a better church plant than the one that had to go out and be bivocational. And I think also we have to pay attention to is we're still a little classist in this.
Go ahead, tell the truth.
Absolutely.
Because I probably would have a better chance at getting the full salary, go plant a church package, than someone that English is their second language and are a lot darker than me. And this is across the church, whether it's the Episcopal Church or all traditions. And I think we need to pay attention to that and figure out how to play fairly, because some of the best lessons we're learning in the Episcopal Church are not coming from our Anglo, English as first language experiences. In our diocese, some of the most amazing missional work is happening amongst our Latino congregations.
Amen.
And that's one of the things that we're still trying to figure out. How do we listen to what's going on there and help that inform everybody else?
I think economics is always going to be a challenge, especially when you come up against, you're starting to see growth and you come up against a kind of a wall. And as James said, that entrepreneurial piece is to how do you get around it? How do you kind of find that D spot and say, oh, I'm sorry. But I look around, and you were talking about Hispanic ministry, and we have a small church in a rural part of our diocese that's 100 miles from the closest city, and so the church is really struggling with trying to fund having a sacramental presence in the community. And I go out and I start talking to them about that, and so we get through this conversation, and I'm basically saying to them, did you all realize that 50% of the people that live in this area around you are all Hispanic? And they're like, oh yeah, and we want to be able to get out there and start doing some things with them. So I go back and tell the story to my group. And so we're trying to look at some creative ways now to kind of move towards helping them kind of discover what's new. So I think part of the economic issue is to be able to go out, hear what opportunities are, and then bring that message back, and then try to figure out how we kind of take those initiatives. And you have to move slowly sometimes, and you can't do it all. So you have to pick and choose how you do that. So the kind of thing I'm doing is trying to actually help discover those ways and those places where we can kind of think around that and try to make the economics fit to that when possible.
Yeah.
If people haven't ever seen, well, I hope you have, Eric Law's work on holy currencies.
Yes.
It's a beautiful, not just image, but strategy for getting resources moving throughout a system and helping people to realize that money is simply one of many currencies,
Yes.
but that money needs to flow through a number of communities frankly, through a number of hands in order to make ministries possible, even as relationship flows, as truth flows, so there are a lot of currencies, and maybe a poorer community, that doesn't have the money to send flowing through will be able to send truth flowing through.
Yes.
And then they're not the ones who are kind of like waiting for a benefactor to show up,
Right.
because frankly they are giving gift as well.
Yes.
So that's a wonderful way to go deeper with that work. Thank you for that question, Emily. And thank you. I believe that we are finishing up on this panel. So
Yeah.
thank you to the panelists. Yay.